Have you ever heard of Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Viking king who terrorized Europe? Or Alfred the Great, the only English king to hold that title? But what if I told you that among these giants stood a third man, a conqueror as brutal as he was strategic, whose role in shaping the England we know today is surprisingly underrated? What do you know about Ubbe Ragnarsson? For too long, history has relegated him to the shadow of his more famous brothers and his greatest adversary. But the truth is that Ubie was the pragmatic mastermind behind some of the Vikings' most devastating campaigns, a leader who not only plundered, but dreamed of building an empire. Get ready to dive into a time when faith and sword clashed, where betrayal was a tactic of war, and where the line between barbarian and builder was thin. Let's demystify the legends and forgotten truths about the great pagan army, and most importantly, about Ubie, the commander who terrorized kingdoms and shaped the future. If this story intrigued you and you want to uncover the secrets of one of the most fascinating periods in history, click the like button right now, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming epic videos, and share it with all your friends who love a good story. Your support allows us to continue spreading knowledge and exploring these incredible chapters of the past. Oh, and tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this? The pale northern sun bathed deep fjords and ancient forests, where a people of seafarers and warriors forged their destiny. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, Europe would witness an unprecedented transformation, driven by the expansion of the Norse, the Viking Age. It was not just an era of plunder and pillage, but of a complex web of trade, colonization, and the relentless search for new lands and riches. Long, high-prowed, shallow-keeled ships cut through the icy waters with astonishing efficiency, allowing these Scandinavian people, who would later be generically called Vikings, to reach distant lands, from Eastern Europe to North America. Before the arrival of the Great Armada, England was not a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each with its own rivalries and ambitions. Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, and Kent vied for power and influence, weakened by internal intrigue and a precarious peace that crumbled at the slightest provocation. Christianity, though established, still faced challenges in some regions where ancient pagan beliefs persisted. Rich monasteries, centers of learning and treasure houses, were tempting targets for early Norse explorers. In 793, the attack on the monastery at Lindisfarne marked the symbolic beginning of this era of raiding, a grim omen of things to come. Initially, these raids were isolated, focused on seizing goods and showing force, with the Vikings returning home with their booty. However, the frequency and scale of these raids gradually increased. From small bands, they grew into sizable fleets, wintering in foreign lands and establishing temporary bases. England, with its fertile lands and flourishing cities, represented an invaluable prize for the Norse, who saw in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms an opportunity to expand their power and perhaps one day put down permanent roots. The disunity among the Anglo-Saxons, their often ineffective defensive tactics, and the wealth of their churches and monasteries were open invitations to Viking ambition. It was a cauldron of tensions, where the fragility of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms clashed with the growing boldness and organization of the northern warriors. This scenario of sporadic but increasingly organized raids would be the prelude to the arrival of a force that would change the destiny of the island forever: the Great Heathen Army, driven by a thirst for revenge and conquest that went beyond the simple desire for plunder. England was on the verge of cataclysm. Amid the sagas and legends that echo through the wooden halls and the icy winds of the north, the name of Ragnar Lothbrok rings out like thunder. Ragnar was not just a king, but a jarl, a warrior, a visionary whose exploits have become entwined with myth itself. His daring raids, unlikely victories, and legendary cunning have made him a near mythic figure, an icon of Viking expansion. He was the architect of daring raids, including the legendary assault on Paris in 845, which solidified his reputation as one of the most fearsome and respected Norse leaders. His influence extended far beyond his own clan. His bravery and leadership inspired legions of warriors and shaped the ambitions of his sons. Yet Ragnar's glory was not destined to last forever. The tale of his death is as compelling as his life, and equally controversial in its historical details. The Norse sagas, full of poetry and drama, recount how Ragnar, in one of his last and most audacious adventures, set out for Northumbria with only 2 ships, underestimating the power of King Ella. Captured, he was subjected to a brutal and humiliating death, thrown into a pit of snakes. As the vipers writhed around him, Ragnar is said to have uttered his last words, a challenge and a prophecy to those who would kill him. How the little pigs would grunt if they knew what the old boar suffers. This phrase, legendary for its resilience and veiled threat, was not just a cry of pain, but a call for vengeance that would echo through the halls of his sons. Although the exact details of Ragnar's death are difficult to verify from contemporary historical sources, the impact of this narrative is undeniable. For Ragnar's sons, Ubie, Ivar, Halfdan, Bjorn, and Sigurd, among others, the news of their father's death was a catalyst. It didn't matter whether the story of the snake pit was literal or an epic metaphor for an ignominious death. What mattered was the disrespect and humiliation inflicted on his legacy. Revenge for the Vikings was not just an act of retribution, but a cultural imperative, a matter of family and tribal honor. Ragnar's death would not only be mourned, but avenged with fire and sword. This thirst for justice, this determination to restore the honor of the Lothbrok name, became the driving force behind the formation of the largest and most cohesive Viking force that England had ever seen, the Great Heathen Army. They were not just seeking plunder or land, they were seeking King Ella, and with him, redress for their father's legacy. The motivation was clear, the cause just, in their eyes, and the fate of England was about to be irrevocably altered by this quest for vengeance. Ragnar's blood cried out, and his sons would answer. The Great Heathen Army was not just a collection of warriors, but an entity forged by the blood ties and complex dynamics of a legendary family, the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Chief among them were Ubie, Ivar the Boneless, and Halfdan. Each brought with them a unique blend of skills, ambitions, and temperaments, shaping the leadership and strategies of the Viking force. This brotherhood, while united by a common goal, to avenge their father and conquer lands, was also fertile ground for rivalries, tacit agreements, and a complex hierarchy that revealed itself on the battlefield and in negotiations. Ubie, the eldest or one of the eldest of the brothers, was often portrayed in the sagas as an experienced warrior and a pragmatic leader. He possessed an imposing stature and a calm but commanding presence that commanded respect among the warriors. His strategic wisdom and negotiating skills were as sharp as his blade. Ubie was not given to blind impulses, preferring careful analysis and alliance building, a notable contrast to some of his brothers. He understood the importance of discipline and cohesion for an army of such magnitude, and his role was often that of mediator between the more volatile personalities of his brothers. There are records that indicate him as a central figure in decision-making and maintaining order within the Armada, being one of the main representatives in talks with the Anglo-Saxon leaders. Ivar the Boneless was perhaps the most feared and enigmatic of Ragnar's sons. His physical condition, which prevented him from walking without support, was inversely proportional to his ferocity and mental cunning. The sagas describe him as a brilliant strategist, a master of psychological warfare, and a ruthless tactician. His mind was as sharp as any sword, and his strategic intellect allowed him to predict the enemy's movements and devise innovative and devastating battle plans. Ivar was ruthless in battle, a berserker who inspired both terror in his enemies and devotion in his own men. His legendary cruelties, such as the execution of King Ella by the Blood Eagle, although this method is debated by historians, made him an almost demonic figure to the Anglo-Saxons. The relationship between Ubie and Ivar was central to the dynamics of the Armada. While Ubie sought stability and settlement, Ivar seemed more interested in power and destruction, a dichotomy that sometimes created tensions but also complemented their respective strengths. Halfdan Ragnarsson, on the other hand, was a fierce and ambitious warrior, often associated with the founding of the Viking dynasty in York. He was more impulsive than Ubie, but equally brave, and his leadership was focused on conquest and establishing territorial power. Halfdan shared Ivar's warrior streak, but had a more practical long-term view of conquest and colonization. A rivalry between Halfdan and Ivar is hinted at by some sources, especially as the great army began to fragment, with each brother seeking his own domain. In addition to these three, other brothers such as Bjorn Ironarm and Sigurd Serpent-Eye are also mentioned in the sagas, although their direct involvement in the Great Armada in England is less detailed or more historically controversial. They represented other factions and ambitions within Ragnar's extended family. This brotherhood, with its strengths and weaknesses, its alliances and tensions, was the backbone of the Great Heathen Armada. Their shared but sometimes contested leadership ensured that the Armada was a formidable and unpredictable force, capable of adapting to and overcoming the challenges posed by the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Revenge for Ragnar was the glue that bound them together, but the individual ambitions and distinct personalities of each brother would shape the course of the invasion and the future of England. The year was 865, and the heir of East Anglia held a premonition of doom. The coastal population, already accustomed to the sporadic raids of small groups of Norsemen, was about to witness something of unprecedented scale and magnitude. On the horizon, a dark smudge appeared, growing rapidly in the sun. It was not the usual few ships of marauders, but an imposing fleet. Hundreds of Drakkar, dragon ships, cutting through the waves with their striped sails adorned with figures of serpents and dragons that seemed to glide over the water. It was the Great Heathen Armada, and its name already echoed the terror it would bring. Led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, this mighty force sought not just plunder, it sought bloody revenge and ultimate conquest. The landing took place in East Anglia, one of the most vulnerable Anglo-Saxon kingdoms due to its coastal position and the relative lack of strong defenses in the east. The choice of location was not random. Strategically, it offered a relatively safe entry point and access to resources. The chronicles of the time, although sparse in precise detail about the exact location, describe the scene with a mixture of horror and awe. Thousands of warriors armed with axes, swords, spears, and shields poured from the ships, occupying the beach and the surrounding lands. Their pagan war cries, the clang of their weapons and the glint of the sun on their helmets and polished armor created a terrifying spectacle for the few local inhabitants who dared to watch or who did not have time to flee. The initial impact was overwhelming. The king of East Anglia at the time, Edmund, had neither the resources nor the preparation to face such a massive and cohesive force. The Vikings quickly established a fortified base, turning the landing site into a winter camp, a clear indication of their intention to remain. This was no seasonal raid. It was an invasion. News of the arrival of the Great Armada spread like wildfire across England. The terror came not just from the ferocity of the warriors, but from their discipline and organization. Unlike the disorganized, marauding hordes of the past, this was a unified force, with clear leaders and a common purpose. They plundered towns and cities, securing supplies and demonstrating their brutality to intimidate any resistance. The local population was forced to flee or submit. Monasteries and churches, rich in treasure and without military defenses, were easy targets and emblematic of their pagan faith and their thirst for wealth. The landing in East Anglia was not just a military event, it was a cultural and psychological shock. To the Anglo-Saxons, it seemed as if the prophecies of the apocalypse had come true. The union of Ragnar's sons, driven by revenge and the ambition to establish dominance, marked the end of the era of isolated raids and the beginning of a new phase in Anglo-Viking relations, that of large-scale territorial conquest. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, accustomed to fighting each other, now faced an external threat that required a unity they had rarely demonstrated. East Anglia was only the first step in the Great Armada's journey of blood and fire, a harbinger of what was to come for the rest of England. The Great Heathen Army was not just a horde of barbarians, but a surprisingly sophisticated military force for its time, whose tactics were adapted and refined by Ragnar's sons, including Ubbe, Ivar, and Halfdan. Far from simply resorting to brute force, the Vikings employed a lethal combination of mobility, surprise, fortification, and war psychology that unsettled the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Their strategies were fluid, adapting to the terrain and nature of the enemy, and this flexibility was one of their greatest advantages. One of the most notable tactics was speed and mobility. Using their longship, long, shallow-drafted ships, the Vikings could navigate rivers and estuaries, penetrating deep into the English interior, far from coastal defenses. This transport capability allowed them to move large numbers of warriors and supplies efficiently, appearing where least expected, and taking Anglo-Saxon armies by surprise. Cavalry, although not their main force, was used for reconnaissance and rapid movement, turning raids into lightning raids that sapped enemy morale. The construction of temporary fortifications known as Denmark, although the term is more associated with defensive structures in Denmark, the concept of temporary fortification applied, was another crucial strategy. Upon landing or settling in for the winter, the Vikings quickly erected palisades, ditches, and earthen walls. These fortified bases, often utilizing natural defenses such as rivers and marshes, served as safe havens for the fleet, allowing them to store booty, repair equipment, and rest without the danger of surprise attack. From within these strongholds, they could launch attacks and retreat to safety, forcing the Anglo-Saxons into costly and often fruitless sieges. The speed with which these fortifications were erected was a testament to Viking discipline and ingenuity. Psychological warfare was an equally powerful tool. The Vikings' reputation for cruelty, fueled by reports of massacres and torture, such as the alleged blood eagle attributed to Ivar, was used to instill fear even before battle. The sight of their raven banners and the sound of their war cries were often enough to demoralize enemy forces. The systematic pillaging of monasteries and churches was not just a quest for wealth, but an act of defiance against the Anglo-Saxons' Christian faith, undermining their confidence and cohesion. On the battlefield, the Vikings were masters of formations like the shield wall, shield city. This compact defensive formation where warriors interlocked their shields created a nearly impenetrable barrier against enemy attacks. At the same time, they were adept at surprise attacks and ambushes, using the terrain to their advantage. Ubie, with his pragmatic leadership, probably played a vital role in organizing and coordinating these tactics. He would have understood the importance of maintaining the cohesion of the armada and of using resources efficiently. Ivar, with his strategic mind, would be the architect of bold and sometimes deceptive plans, exploiting the enemy's weaknesses. Halfdan, as a direct warrior, would lead the more frontal charges and aggressive skirmishes. They also employed a scorched earth strategy when necessary, burning crops and villages to deny the Anglo-Saxons resources and weaken their ability to sustain an army. The requirement for Dane money, a tribute paid in silver to the Vikings to make them leave, was another clever tactic. Although it seemed like a peace agreement, it often served to replenish their treasuries and finance future campaigns, as well as weakening the kingdoms economically. This combination of mobility, military engineering, terror, and extortion made the great heathen army a nearly invincible force for many years, paving the way for the conquest of vast territories in England. The city of York, known to the Anglo-Saxons as Eoforwic, was a jewel in the north of England. With its deep Roman roots, evident in the ruins of its aqueduct and fortifications, and its strategic position on the River Ouse, it was not only an administrative and religious center of Northumbria, but also a vibrant trading post. Its capture represented not only a military victory, but a devastating blow to the heart of Anglo-Saxon power in the region and an enviable base of operations for Norse invaders. In 866, after a winter of preparation in East Anglia, the great heathen army, led by Ragnar's sons, including Ubie and Ivar, turned its attention north. Northumbria, a kingdom riven by internal strife, was a ripe target for conquest. There was a fierce rivalry between two claimants to the throne, Osbert and Ella, the latter the king who, according to the sagas, condemned Ragnar Lothbrok to death. Disunity was the Anglo-Saxons' greatest weakness, and the Vikings exploited it skillfully. In 866, the Armada marched on York. The city, despite its ancient Roman fortifications, was unprepared for the brutal and organized siege of the Vikings. The chronicles describe a relatively quick capture, with the population and garrisons being subdued with ferocity. For the Anglo-Saxons, the fall of York came as a shock. However, The rivalry between Osbert and Ella led them to make a fatal mistake. Instead of uniting against the common invader, they initially fought separately or with minimal coordination. It was in March 867 that the two rival kings of Northumbria, Osbert and Ella, finally joined forces in a desperate attempt to retake York. They launched a massive attack on the city, intending to drive out the Vikings. However, Ragnar's sons, particularly Ivar, demonstrated their tactical superiority. The Vikings, entrenched within the Roman fortifications and with iron discipline, awaited the Anglo-Saxon attack. When Osbert and Ella's forces entered the city, perhaps in an attempt to engage in hand-to-hand combat, the Vikings launched a brutal and well-coordinated counteroffensive. The ensuing battle was a massacre. Both Anglo-Saxon kings, Osbert and Ella, were killed in the fighting. Although the sagas describe Ella's death as particularly gruesome, through the blood eagle ritual performed by Ivar, it is important to note that the exact historicity of this ritual is debated by historians, with it being more likely that he died in battle. The fact remains that the deaths of both kings sealed the fate of Northumbria, and with it, the conquest of York by the Vikings. The capture of York was not just a military victory, it was a turning point. The city, renamed Jorvik by the Vikings, became the capital of a new Norse domain in the heart of England. It was from Jorvik that the Vikings, especially under the leadership of Halfdan in later years, would consolidate their power and rule over vast swaths of northern England, establishing a dynasty that would endure for decades. For Ubie, the capture of York represented the fulfillment of one of the first great aims of the Great Armada, not just revenge, but the creation of a solid base for Viking expansion and settlement, a true pagan kingdom on English soil. The fall of York was a grim omen for the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, who now saw the full extent of the threat that loomed over them. Within the formidable Great Heathen Army, leadership was shared, but the influence of a few names stood out. Among Ragnar's sons, Ubie quickly emerged as a commander of remarkable caliber, whose growing influence was undeniable. It was not only his lineage as the son of Ragnar Lothbrok that gave him authority, but his wit, his pragmatism, and his ability to inspire loyalty among his warriors. Where Ivar was the tactical genius and the brute force, Ubbe represented the more stable mind and the more diplomatic face of the invasion. His rise to prominence as a leading figure was due to a combination of factors. First, his experience in previous campaigns, even before the Great Armada, had probably given him invaluable practical knowledge of warfare and the logistics of long-distance expeditions. Second, his age and maturity made him a respected figure among the warriors, many of whom were young and eager for glory. Ubie was not an impulsive leader. He was thoughtful. He assessed risks and, crucially, he knew how to negotiate. During the early campaigns, especially in East Anglia and Northumbria, Ubie played a vital role in organizing the Viking forces. While Ivar could be the mastermind behind the most audacious and ruthless battle strategies, Ubie was essential to the day-to-day running of the Armada, organizing camps, securing supplies, maintaining discipline, and, perhaps most importantly, mediating between the different factions and warlords that made up the vast Armada. The Great Armada was not a homogeneous army. It was a coalition of different jarls and their followers, each with their own ambitions and rivalries. Ubie's ability to unite these disparate parties around a common goal was testament to his leadership skills. He was often the Vikings' representative in negotiations with the Anglo-Saxons. On several occasions, the Anglo-Saxon kings sought peace agreements, usually in the form of payments of Dane money, Danish tribute, so that the Armada would cease its attacks. Ubie, with his more pragmatic approach, was the ideal figure to lead these conversations. He understood that constant war depleted resources, and that truce agreements, even if temporary, could be advantageous in resupplying the Armada and positioning it for future campaigns. There are records of Ubie acting as guarantor of agreements, such as the Oath of Peace with King Alfred, although these oaths were often broken by the Vikings, showing the complexity and distrust inherent in these relationships. Although the sagas often highlight Ivar's ferocity and Halfdan's ambition, Ubie's constant presence in multiple theaters of war and his frequent mention in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles which are generally sparse on details about Viking personalities, suggest that his influence was more than merely nominal. He was a pillar of the great army's leadership, ensuring that the vision of conquest and settlement remained alive, even as the army splintered into different groups. Ubie was the long-term strategist, the leader who looked beyond immediate plunder to the establishment of lasting Viking rule in England. His ability to maintain the cohesion and focus of the army, even in the face of internal and external challenges, cemented his position as one of the most important commanders of the invasion. The great heathen army was a force united by a common goal: revenge for Ragnar and the conquest of England. But at the heart of this unity was the complex and sometimes fraught relationship between two of its chief leaders, Ubie and Ivar, the Boneless. Although blood brothers, born of the same legend, their personalities, tactical approaches, and arguably, their visions of the future for the Viking domains were markedly different, creating a partnership dynamic that was both complementary and potentially conflictual. Ivar, with his brilliant mind and unparalleled ferocity, was the supreme strategist, the architect of the Armada's most brutal and audacious victories. He was terror incarnate, a master of psychological warfare and tactics, whose decisions were ruthless and effective. His physical disability, far from being a weakness, seemed to have sharpened his intelligence and cruelty, making him an almost mythical figure, feared even by his own men. Ivar seemed to disdain compromise, preferring annihilation and total submission, and his goals seemed to be absolute power, the destruction of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the establishment of unchallenged Viking rule. Ubie, on the other hand, represented a more pragmatic approach, older and more thoughtful. He was the Armada's diplomat, the negotiator, the one who saw beyond immediate plunder and bloody retribution. His vision was for settlement, for colonization, for building a lasting Viking kingdom on English soil. Ubie understood the need for logistics, for temporary arrangements, and for maintaining a semblance of order even amid the chaos of war. He was the stabilizing force, the glue that sometimes held the Armada together when individual ambitions threatened to tear it apart. The complexity of the relationship between the two brothers lay precisely in these differences. At crucial moments, their skills complemented each other brilliantly. Ivar's ferocity paved the way for Ubie's negotiation. Ubie's vision for the settlement benefited from Ivar's ruthless military conquests. York's victories and the subjugation of Anglo-Saxon kings were largely the result of this lethal partnership. Ubie could handle the administrative and diplomatic matters, while Ivar focused on overwhelming military force. However, there is evidence in the chronicles and sagas that the relationship was not always harmonious. Their differing ambitions and approaches could lead to friction. The fact that the great army split into separate groups after the initial campaign, with Ivar heading to Ireland and Halfdan, another brother, to the north of England, while Ubie remained with a significant part of the army in the east, suggests that there was not always a consensus on the way forward. It is possible that Ivar, with his more radical nature, was not content with whatever peace terms or agreements Ubie could negotiate, or that their long-term visions for Viking rule differed. The lack of detailed records of direct disputes between the brothers in the Anglo-Saxon sources does not mean that they did not exist. The chronicles focused more on the outcome of the raid. Ultimately, the partnership between Ubbe and Ivar was key to the initial success of the Great Armada. They were two halves of a formidable war machine, the brutal tactical brain of one, the strategic and diplomatic nous of the other. The strength of the union of Ragnar's sons, personified by this duo, was what allowed the Vikings to ravage England and lay the foundations for the future Danelaw. Their parting of ways, while sometimes fraught with disagreement, also opened the door for Viking expansion on different fronts, further consolidating Norse power on the island. After the decisive victory in East Anglia and the establishment of their base, the great heathen army, led by Ragnar's sons, set their sights on an even more ambitious target, Northumbria. This kingdom, which encompassed much of what is now northeastern England and parts of Scotland, was one of the most powerful and culturally rich of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but also one of the most divided. Its internal disunity would be key to its downfall under the relentless Viking advance. The campaign against Northumbria began strategically. The Vikings, with their usual mobility and surprise, marched north in 866. The timing was crucial. The kingdom was embroiled in civil war. Two rival claimants were vying for the throne: Osbert, the deposed king, and Ella, the usurper who had seized power. This fateful division severely weakened the kingdom's ability to mount a unified and effective defense against external threat. Political fragmentation and enmity among its own leaders meant that Northumbria was in no position to resist a force as cohesive and determined as the Great Army. The first major objective was the city of York, Eoforwich, a vital center of Anglo-Saxon trade and power. The city fell quickly in November 866. The Vikings, taking advantage of the Anglo-Saxon disorganization, settled there for the winter. The chronicles tell of a merciless invasion. The lands were devastated, villages burned, and the local population subjected to terror and pillage. Temples and monasteries, rich in treasures, were plundered without mercy, demonstrating the pagan nature and indifference of the invaders to the Christian faith. Despite their rivalry, Osbert and Ella, faced with the impending catastrophe, finally realized the gravity of the threat and joined forces in a desperate attempt to retake York in March 867. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe the battle as a bloody and decisive encounter. The kings, leading their armies, threw themselves against the Viking defenses. However, the organization and tactics of Ragnar's sons, particularly the genius of Ivar and the solidity of Ubbe, proved superior. The Vikings not only withstood the attack, but launched a devastating counterattack. The outcome of the Battle of York was catastrophic for Northumbria. Both kings, Osbert and Ella, were killed in the battle. Ella's death is particularly shrouded in legend. The Norse sagas relate that Ivar, in revenge for the death of his father Ragnar, subjected Ella to the brutal ritual of the blood eagle, where her ribs were severed from her spine to form bloody wings, and her lungs were exposed. Although the historicity of this ritual is widely debated by modern scholars, with it being most likely that Ella died in battle, the legend served to amplify the terror and reputation for cruelty of the Vikings, especially Ivar. With the death of its kings and the devastation of its territory, Northumbria was effectively dismembered. Not only did the Vikings consolidate their control over York, which would become Jorvik, the capital of a new Norse kingdom, but they also imposed a puppet king, Egbert, over part of the remaining territory, ensuring that the kingdom would never again pose a threat. The Northumbrian campaign was not just a series of military victories. It was an act of political annihilation, paving the way for the permanent settlement of the Vikings and the formation of the Danelaw, the area of England under Danish rule. The once proud kingdom of Northumbria was the first to feel the full wrath of Ragnar's sons. The campaigns of the Great Heathen Armada were not uninterrupted. Interspersed between periods of intense plundering, battle and marching were winters in the Viking camps. Far from being mere respites, these periods were crucial to the logistics, planning, and very survival of the Armada. They revealed a more organized and less chaotic side of Viking life on campaign, demystifying the image of mere wandering raiders. At the end of the campaign season, usually with the arrival of autumn and the deterioration of the weather conditions for navigation and combat, the Great Armada would seek a strategic location to establish itself. This location was chosen based on its natural defensive capacity, often at the confluence of rivers, river islands, or marshy areas, and from there, the Vikings would employ their remarkable engineering skills to build temporary but sturdy fortifications. Wooden palisades, deep ditches, and earth and rubble walls were quickly erected, transforming the camp into a veritable fortress. Burger Heersgerein Anglo-Saxon chronicles meaning army camp. Notable examples include Torksey in 872-873, Repton in 873-874, and Fulham in 878-879. The speed and efficiency with which these structures were built demonstrate a discipline and organization that belies the image of barbarians. Logistics were a monumental challenge. The Armada, consisting of thousands of warriors, required constant supplies. During the winter, these supplies were accumulated by pillaging the surrounding areas before retreating, and sometimes by imposing tribute, Dane money, to local kingdoms, which preferred to pay rather than to avoid devastation. Camps served as storage centers for war booty, silver, jewelry, cloth, and food. Warriors needed provisions, but also maintenance for their weapons and armor. Makeshift smithies were set up, repairing swords and axes, and new supplies were produced. Wood was essential for fire and construction, water for drinking and hygiene, and animals for food. The warrior's life in the winter camp was not one of total idleness, although there were periods of rest. In addition to maintenance and repair, the warriors trained, honing their combat skills and keeping in shape. Hierarchy was maintained, and strategic decisions for the upcoming campaign season were debated by leaders such as Ubie and Ivar. It was also a time for idleness, for telling stories of heroic deeds, for strategy games such as Fist Power, a Nordic board game, and for the forging of social bonds between warriors. Pagan religion would also have its place, with rituals and offerings. Although historical sources are sparse on intimate details of daily life, the ability of the Great Army to regroup, resupply, and maintain cohesion after each winter is a testament to the effectiveness of these camps. They were not just shelters, they were temporary centers of power, platforms for future conquest and moments of strategic respite. For the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, winter did not bring relief but rather the terror of anticipation, knowing that with the arrival of spring, Viking fury would be renewed and directed at a new target. Winters in camp were a testament to the resilience and tactical intelligence of the Vikings, who knew how to turn the harshness of the weather to their strategic advantage. If this intriguing story about Viking winters has surprised you and made you reflect on the complexity of these warriors, why not join us on this journey through the past? Leave a like, subscribe so you don't miss any of our next dives into history, and share this video with your friends and family. Each like and subscription not only helps us spread the knowledge and beauty of history, but is also a valuable reward for the work we do. Also, we'd love to know, where are you watching this video from? Leave a comment and tell us which city and country you're following us from. Your participation is what motivates us to continue exploring the mysteries of the past. Despite the popular image of the Vikings as ruthless raiders, the great heathen army, led by figures such as Ubie and Ivar, demonstrated a remarkable ability to combine brute force with diplomatic cunning. Negotiations and the demand for tribute, known as Danegeld, literally Danish money, were an intrinsic part of their strategy of conquest. Far from being acts of weakness, these peace agreements were in fact effective tools of extortion that undermined the Anglo-Saxon economy and financed the Vikings' ongoing campaigns. After a series of devastating victories, or to avoid total destruction, desperate Anglo-Saxon kings often sought an agreement with the invaders. Dane money became the most common solution. It was a substantial payment in gold, and especially silver, offered to the Vikings in exchange for ceasing their hostilities and, ideally, leaving. To the Anglo-Saxons, it seemed like a lesser evil compared to pillaging and ravaging their lands. To the Vikings, it was an efficient and less risky way of accumulating wealth and replenishing their treasuries without the need for prolonged and costly combat. The first significant mention of Dane money, the first tribute paid to the Great Armada, occurred in 865, when the Kentish people attempted to buy peace, although the Vikings broke the agreement and ravaged the region. Later, after the invasion of East Anglia in 865–66, King Edmund was forced to pay a heavy tribute. In 868, King Burgred of Mercia, facing the Viking invasion, sought help from Wessex and, unable to drive the Norsemen back, also had to pay them a temporary withdrawal. Ubie, with his pragmatic nature and skill as a negotiator, probably played a crucial role in these transactions. He would understand that the Dane money was not only a source of wealth, but a way to weaken the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms without wasting lives and resources on unnecessary battles. These peace attempts were, in fact, strategic pauses for the Vikings. The money allowed them to rearm, resupply, and prepare for the next phase of the invasion. Furthermore, the Vikings' frequent breaking of oaths and peace agreements demonstrated their lack of trust in Anglo-Saxon promises and their willingness to use peace as a mere prelude to more raids. It is crucial to note that these agreements were almost always unilateral, dictated by the strength of the Vikings. The Anglo-Saxons, in their despair, believed that the peace they had bought would last, but the Vikings saw Thedane money as payment for the right to move on to the next target. This tactic of extortion and financial submission was a vital part of the campaign of attrition against the English kingdoms. It not only enriched the invaders, but also undermined the authority of the Anglo-Saxon kings and the confidence of their people in their ability to protect them. Dane money, it was a symbol of growing Viking hegemony and a dark harbinger of the dominance that would be consolidated with the establishment of the Danelaw. Silver flowed into Viking coffers, and with it, power. The great heathen army, though a formidable and cohesive force in its early years of invading England, did not remain a monolithic entity forever. As the campaigns progressed and new territories were conquered, rumors and possible disagreements arose that would eventually lead to its fragmentation into different factions. Such division was natural in an army composed of many jarls and their followers, each with their own ambitions and visions for the future. After the conquests of East Anglia and Northumbria, and the consolidation of York as a Viking base, Jorvik, the original goal of revenge for the death of Ragnar Lothbrok was largely accomplished. With revenge accomplished, the individual ambitions of the leaders began to take precedence over the common goal. While some, like Ubie, might have been more inclined to settle and consolidate a permanent domain, others, like Ivar and Halfdan, might have had different views on expansion and plunder. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles, while not detailing internal Viking conversations, record movements of the Armada that suggest this fragmentation. In 871, after the Battle of Ashdown against Alfred of Wessex, the Armada split. A significant portion, led by Halfdan, returned to Northumbria in 872-873, with the clear intention of settling and ruling the kingdom of Jorvik. Halfdan proclaimed himself king, indicating a shift in focus from plunder to settlement and the creation of a kingdom. Ivar the Boneless, on the other hand, is often associated with campaigns in Ireland and the British Isles further west. Irish sources mention him as one of the Viking leaders of Dublin, where he established a dynasty. Although there is no definitive evidence of a violent break between Ivar and his brothers in England, his absence from later campaigns in England suggests that his interests and ambitions had turned to other theaters of operation. It is plausible that Ivar's outlook, perhaps more focused on continued plunder and leading warbands rather than settlement, led him to seek new opportunities. Ubie remained with a considerable part of the Armada, continuing the campaigns in the east and south of England, concentrating on areas such as Mercia and later Wessex. His presence at key events such as the Siege of Wareham and the Battle of Sinwit, where he is said to have died, indicates that he led one of the main factions that continued to pressure the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This division into three main fronts, Halfdan in the north, Ivar in the west, Ireland, and Ubie in the southeast, shows that the Great Armada, although born of unity, was not immune to internal pressures and the differing ambitions of its charismatic leaders. These divisions did not necessarily imply armed conflict between the brothers, but rather differing strategic objectives. One wanted a kingdom in the north, another preferred the lucrative slave trade and plunder in the Western Isles, and the third sought domination of the rest of England. This fragmentation, paradoxically, increased the pressure on the Anglo-Saxons, as they now faced multiple threats from different directions, each led by a son of Ragnar with his own legion of warriors. The division of the Armada marked the transition from a unified invasion force to the formation of multiple Viking kingdoms and domains in Britain and Ireland. At first, Viking raids on England were largely motivated by plunder and pillage, with warriors returning to their homelands with their spoils. However, with the arrival of the Great Heathen Armada, the nature of the invasion changed dramatically. Driven by revenge and led by strategists such as Ubie and Ivar, the Vikings began to nurture a much grander ambition. The dream of establishing a great Viking kingdom on English soil, a lasting dominion that would transcend mere plunder and become an intrinsic part of the island's political landscape. This ambition was not just territorial, but also economic and social. The lands of England were fertile and ideal for agriculture, a stark contrast to the often more arid and icy lands of Scandinavia. The climate was milder, and the cities offered opportunities for trade and settlement. For many Vikings, England represented a land of opportunity. a place where they could build a new life, far from the demographic pressures and internal rivalries of their homelands. The conquest of Jorvik, was the first concrete and monumental step in this direction. Rather than sacking and abandoning the city, the Vikings made it their capital in northern England. The appointment of puppet kings, such as Egbert in Northumbria, and later, the direct takeover of the government by Viking leaders, such as Halfdan, one of Ubbe's brothers, demonstrated this long-term intention. This was no longer a temporary occupation, but a colonization. Ubbe, in particular, is often associated with this vision of settlement. His more pragmatic stance and his involvement in peace negotiations and the establishment of bases suggest that he understood the need to consolidate conquests. While Ivar may have been more focused on the glory of battle and revenge, Ubbe seemed to look to the future, envisioning a prosperous and self-sufficient Viking territory in England. The requirement for Dane money, it also evolved from mere tribute to a payment for permission to settle, as occurred in parts of Mercia and East Anglia, where the Vikings, after receiving the money, instead of leaving, settled down and began to cultivate the land. The dream of a great Viking kingdom was not utopian. It gradually materialized in the formation of the Danelaw, Danelaw, the Law of the Danes. This vast area of eastern and northern England, which included East Anglia, Northumbria, and parts of Mercia, came to be governed according to Danish laws and customs, with a mixed population of Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. Cities such as Jorvik, York, and the Danelaw became centers of Viking power, with flourishing economies and a hybrid culture that blended Norse and Anglo-Saxon elements. The ambition of Ragnar's sons, and Ubbe in particular, was to forge a Viking empire that depended not only on the sword, but on political and social organization. Although Viking rule in England did not last indefinitely as a unified empire, the dream of a lasting kingdom led to the creation of permanent settlements, the introduction of new laws and customs, and a profound transformation of the social and political landscape of England. The Danelaw, a direct result of this ambition, would be a lasting testament to the vision of Viking leaders who saw England not just as a battlefield, but as a home. As the great heathen army marched relentlessly across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, laying waste to territory and establishing its rule, a singular figure emerged in the kingdom of Wessex who was destined to become the greatest obstacle to their plans for total conquest: Alfred the Great. The encounters between the Vikings and Alfred were not mere military confrontations. They were a clash of wills, an epic duel that would define the future of England. These early clashes not only tested the resilience of Wessex, but also marked the beginning of one of the greatest rivalries in British history. Alfred ascended the throne of Wessex in 871, a particularly dark year for the kingdom, which was under intense pressure from the Vikings. His brother and predecessor, Ethelred, had fought multiple battles against the Great Armada, and the kingdom was exhausted. Alfred inherited a crown amid chaos and an existential threat. His first task was to confront the Armada, which at the time was led by the likes of Ubie, Ivar, and Halfdan. The early engagements were brutal and with mixed results. In 871, a series of battles took place in Wessex, including the famous Battle of Ashdown, where Alfred won a crucial but not decisive victory. The great army was numerous and resilient, and even when defeated in one engagement, it quickly regrouped. On the other hand, Alfred had to deal with defeats, such as that at Wilton in the same year, which forced him to pay Dane money to the Vikings to withdraw from Wessex for a time. These payments, though humiliating, were a tactic to buy time, allowing Alfred to strengthen his defenses and reorganize his forces. The rivalry with Alfred was not merely military, it was a clash of ideologies. For the Vikings, represented by Ubie in his negotiations and campaigns in the east and south, Wessex was the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon resistance, the last Christian kingdom to challenge their hegemony. For Alfred, the confrontation with the Vikings was a struggle for the survival of his people, his culture, and his faith. He saw the Vikings not simply as invaders, but as a threat to civilization itself. The Vikings, under the leadership of Ubie and his brothers, repeatedly attempted to crush Wessex. In 875, the Armada split again, with one part, possibly led by Ubie, attacking Mercia and establishing a puppet king, while another faction, eventually joining forces, turned its attention to Wessex. In 876, the Vikings, led by Guthrum, established a base at Wareham, within the borders of Wessex, signaling their intention to conquer the kingdom once and for all. The escalation of the rivalry was evident. Alfred, who had initially adopted a strategy of guerrilla warfare and negotiation, began to realize that peace with the Vikings was always temporary. They would break oaths and return with the same ferocity. The series of Viking raids and retreats, followed by more raids, hardened Alfred's resolve. He began to reform his military forces, building defensive fortresses, the burhs, and reorganizing your fired militia army for a more effective response. Ubie's presence in many of these early campaigns and negotiations with Alfred shows that he was a central figure in this growing rivalry, one of the main opponents of the King of Wessex. England was becoming a chessboard, with Ubbe and Alfred as the main players, each seeking ultimate victory. The year 871 was a time of intense testing for the Kingdom of Wessex, the last Anglo-Saxon stronghold that still held out against the onslaught of the great heathen army. After a series of defeats and Pyrrhic victories, the climax of the initial campaign in Wessex came in January 871, when the Anglo-Saxon forces, led by the brothers King Ethelred of Wessex and his brother, the future Alfred the Great, confronted the Viking force in one of the largest and most decisive engagements of the age, the Battle of Ashdown. The Viking fleet, commanded by Halfdan and Bagsec, with the participation of other leaders such as Ubbe, although his exact presence is debated in some sources, he was one of the main commanders of the fleet at the time and was certainly involved in the campaign in Wessex, had advanced into the heart of Wessex. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe the Vikings as having taken up position on a hill, possibly King Standing Hill or White Horse Hill, but the exact location is still a matter of debate. Using the advantage of the high ground for their defense, they formed their fearsome shield wall, a nearly impenetrable formation. The Anglo-Saxon army, divided into two fronts, advanced. King Ethelred led one part, while Alfred commanded the other. Sources suggest that King Ethelred was late for battle because he was in prayer. Alfred, seeing that the enemy would not wait, took the initiative to attack alone with his division. This moment of audacity or desperation by Alfred is one of the most dramatic moments in the account of the battle, highlighting his bravery and emerging leadership. He led the charge up the hill, crashing into the Viking shield wall. The battle was brutal. Anglo-Saxon chronicles tell of a fierce battle, with heavy casualties on both sides. The Battle of Ashdown was not a skirmish, but a full-scale engagement, where the discipline and ferocity of both armies were tested to the limit. The turning point of the battle came when the Anglo-Saxons, either with the arrival of Ethelred's forces or due to Alfred's perseverance, managed to break the Viking formation. Chaos ensued in the Norse ranks, and the previously unshakable shield wall gave way. The victory at Ashdown was decisive for Wessex. One of the two Viking kings, Bagsec, was killed in the battle, and many Viking jarls also perished. The Vikings' losses were significant, forcing them into a disorderly retreat. For the Anglo-Saxons, it was a huge morale-boosting victory, which renewed hope that the invaders could be defeated. However, even with this victory, the losses on both sides were heavy, and the Anglo-Saxon army was exhausted. Despite the defeat, the great heathen army, under the leadership of Halfdan, and with the likely continued participation of Ubie, quickly regrouped. They were resilient and would soon be back on the attack. Ashdown, then, was not the end of the war, but a crucial pause, a demonstration that the Vikings were not invincible. For Alfred, it was a trial by fire that solidified his reputation as a military leader and a tireless defender of his kingdom, a man capable of facing the most fearsome force of his time. It was a moment of glory in a year of extreme difficulty for Wessex. After the intense campaign of 871, which included the brutal Battle of Ashdown and a series of other engagements in Wessex, the great heathen army entered a period that can be characterized by profound uncertainty about the future. Far from being a total defeat, Ashdown was a significant setback that, combined with the wear and tear of years of campaigning and the unexpected resilience of Alfred of Wessex, forced the Vikings into a phase of retreat and regrouping. This phase revealed the adaptability of the army, but also the tensions and the search for new objectives. Immediately after Ashdown, the Vikings were defeated again at Basing, but quickly regrouped at Reading. The Armada's resilience was remarkable. They could absorb losses and return to the fight with remarkable speed. However, the constant pressure from Wessex and the need to resupply and consolidate their conquests led to a change of strategy. Dane money was again demanded and paid by Alfred for the Vikings to leave Wessex. In 872, the Armada, or a significant part of it, marched north to London, which was under Mercian control, where they spent the winter. This movement suggests a search for new targets and a temporary break from the stubborn resistance of Wessex. In 873, the Armada moved to Repton in Mercia. Repton was an important monastic center and a strategic location, where the Vikings established a large winter base, noted for its extensive fortifications, including a large barrow that may contain the remains of an important Viking leader, possibly Halfdan. It was at Repton that the division of the Armada became more evident and consolidated. In 874, after the winter, the Great Armada formally split. One faction, led by Halfdan, returned to Northumbria with the intention of settling permanently. Halfdan became the Viking king of Jorvik, establishing a dynasty and beginning the colonization of the region. His departure north represented a clear desire for settlement and rule, not just plunder. The other faction, which included Ubie and Guthrum, a new prominent leader who emerged at this time, remained in the south and east of England, continuing to press into Mercia and later Wessex itself. This split shows the uncertainty of the future of the Armada as a unified force. Each leader now pursued his own goals, whether colonization, like Halfdan, or continued campaigns of conquest, like Ubie and Guthrum. For Ubbe, this phase represented a need to reassess strategy and find new avenues for Viking ambition, whether through further conquest or by seeking settlement in other regions. The retreats were not escapes, but strategic moves to reassess forces, resupply, and choose the next most lucrative or vulnerable targets. The regroupings, in turn, demonstrated the Vikings' remarkable organizational skills. Even fragmented, the Great Armada continued to pose an existential threat to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, adapting and seeking new ways to achieve its goals of dominance and wealth. Uncertainty hung not only over the Anglo-Saxons, but also over the very future of the ambitious Viking enterprise. The Great Heathen Armada, although primarily a force of military conquest, did not rely solely on brute force. Ragnar's sons, and in particular Ubie with his pragmatic acumen, understood the importance of diplomatic and military tactics in consolidating power and achieving their long-term goals. The alliance with Mercia, although forced and temporary in nature, is a remarkable example of how the Vikings were able to exploit the internal tensions and weaknesses of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to their own advantage. Mercia, a once powerful kingdom, was in decline, and under increasing pressure from Wessex to the south and the Vikings to the east. After initial campaigns and the conquest of Northumbria, the Great Armada turned its attention to Mercia in the mid-870s. In 874, after wintering at Repton and becoming fragmented, a significant part of the Armada, including Ubie and Guthrum, invaded the Mercian heartland. The Mercian king Burgred, unable to withstand the overwhelming strength of the Vikings, was deposed and forced to flee to Rome. Rather than simply annul the kingdom and annex all of its territory, the Vikings opted for a more subtle and cunning strategy, installing a puppet king. A nobleman named Ceolwulf II was elevated to the throne. Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe him with disdain, referring to him as an inept king and puppet of the devil, who swore fealty to the Vikings and promised to pay tribute and submission. This alliance or subordination with Ceolwulf II served several strategic purposes for the Vikings. First, it legitimized, in the eyes of some, the Viking presence in Mercia, at least in part. Instead of being just raiders, they could present themselves as protectors or supporters of a local faction. Second, it allowed the Vikings to extract resources and tribute in a more organized way, without having to directly administer the entire territory. Ceolwulf and his court would be responsible for collecting the Dane money and provide it to the Vikings, saving them the trouble of continual plundering and administration. Third, and crucially, the existence of an ally Mercian king created a political and military buffer between the Viking holdings in the east and the resistant kingdom of Wessex, ruled by Alfred. This allowed the Vikings to concentrate their forces wherever they wished, without the worry of a unified Mercian-Saxon front. This diplomatic tactic demonstrated the strategic sophistication of Viking leaders like Ubie. They were not blind to the internal politics of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and knew how to exploit existing divisions. The alliance with Mercia was not a partnership of equals but a veiled subjugation, a way of consolidating their power without the need for total and direct control. However, this alliance was fragile and temporary. In 877, the Vikings did not hesitate to break the agreement, dividing the Mercian territory between themselves. One part was given to Ceolwulf to rule under his rule, and the other was colonized directly by the Vikings, reflecting their desire for permanent settlement. The alliance with Mercia, therefore, was a tactical move for the Vikings, a demonstration of their ability to manipulate Anglo-Saxon politics for their own ends of conquest and colonization. Throughout their campaigns in England, the Great Heathen Army, led by figures such as Ubbe, Ivar, and Guthrum, frequently entered into oaths of peace with the Anglo-Saxon kings. These oaths, sealed by the exchange of hostages and, crucially, the payment of Danegeld, were seen by the Anglo-Saxons as a means of buying time and avoiding devastation. However, for the Vikings, these truces were often tactical, opportunities to resupply, regroup, and, inevitably, prepare for the resumption of hostilities, demonstrating a betrayal that would become a hallmark of their campaign. Breaking these oaths was not an exception, but almost a rule. After the hard campaign in Wessex in 871, Alfred of Wessex paid a Dane money significant for the Vikings to leave their kingdom. However, the peace was short-lived. In 875, a part of the Armada, led by Guthrum, Oscatel, and Anwend, returned to attack Wessex. They established their base at Wareham, a fortified position on the coast, demonstrating their intention to establish themselves in the heart of Alfred's kingdom. In 876, a new oath of peace was forced upon Alfred. The Vikings, under the leadership of Guthrum, and possibly with Ubie present, swore an oath on a sacred ring and gave hostages to the King of Wessex, promising to leave. To the Vikings, this oath on sacred rings, possibly Thor's rings or other pagan artifacts, was a serious commitment, but their interpretation of the validity of such oaths on foreign soil, especially with Christian leaders, may have been flexible. However, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the Vikings immediately, i.e. very soon, broke the oath. They massacred the hostages given to Alfred and fled by night to Exeter, taking Alfred's cavalry as they followed by surprise. This breaking of the oath was a devastating blow to Anglo-Saxon confidence and a bitter lesson for Alfred. It reinforced the perception that the Vikings' word could not be trusted and that the peace they had bought was only a temporary illusion. For the Vikings, this strategy of swearing and breaking an oath was highly effective. They gained time, obtained wealth, the Dane money, and kept their opponents in a constant state of uncertainty and unpreparedness. Ubie's presence in many of the events that preceded or followed these oath-breakings suggests his involvement, either as one of the architects of these tactics or as one of the leaders who carried them out. He was a pragmatic commander, and for the Vikings, survival and conquest justified breaking agreements that were unfavorable to them. The betrayal at Exeter and other similar instances marked an escalation in hostilities and an intensification of psychological warfare. Alfred learned that the only lasting peace would be achieved by force. This realization led him to radically reform Wessex's defenses, building burhs, fortified strongholds, and reorganizing their army, preparing for the inevitable final battle. The breaking of the oaths, therefore, not only served the Vikings' immediate goals, but also unwittingly strengthened the resolve of their greatest adversary, paving the way for the decisive confrontation. Since their arrival in 865, the Great Heathen Army had ravaged and subjugated Northumbria and much of Mercia and East Anglia. However, the Kingdom of Wessex in southern England remained a persistent thorn in the side of the Viking invaders. Under the astute leadership of Alfred the Great, Wessex became the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon resistance, and the Viking campaign in Wessex turned into a prolonged and exhausting war of attrition, a constant pressure that nearly brought the kingdom to ruin. After the initial campaigns and the Battle of Ashdown in 871, which proved costly to both sides, the Vikings, led by Guthrum, and with the likely continued participation of Ubie and other prominent jarls, turned their attention to Wessex with renewed determination in 875. They established bases at strategic points such as Wareham in 876 and Exeter in 877, demonstrating a clear intention to colonize the kingdom. These were no mere raids. They were military operations aimed at conquest and settlement. The Viking strategy was one of continuous pressure. They used the mobility of their ships to move quickly along rivers and coasts, attacking different points of the kingdom. Oaths of peace, such as the one made at Wareham, were frequently broken, serving only to confuse and demoralize the Anglo-Saxons, as well as to extort more Dane money. This false peace tactic drained Wessex's resources and kept the kingdom in a constant state of alert and tension. The height of this pressure came in the winter of 878. In a surprise and devastating blow, the Vikings, taking advantage of the Christmas holiday period, launched an attack on Chippenham, one of Alfred's royal residences. This attack was so effective that it forced Alfred to flee to the Athelney marshes in Somerset. Reduced to a guerrilla figure, the situation looked hopeless for Wessex. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes Alfred's escape, painting a picture of despair. The great heathen army mounted their horses and went to Chippenham and invaded the land of Wessex and sat down therein and drove out many of the inhabitants and subdued the greater part of the people to themselves, except King Alfred, with a small band of his thanes. To the Vikings, including Ubbe, this seemed like the final victory. The King of Wessex was on the run, his kingdom devastated. The conquest of England seemed complete. The campaign in Wessex was not just about pillaging. It was about breaking the last bastion of resistance, about imposing Viking rule over the entire island. Alfred's tenacity, however, underestimated by many, would prove the greatest obstacle. His ability to hide and then re-emerge would be the most unexpected turn of events for the Vikings, who were so close to their goal. The constant pressure on Wessex was the prelude to the decisive battle that was to come. While the popular image of the Vikings is that of nomadic warriors, constantly on the move and pillaging, the historical reality of the great heathen army, especially under the leadership of figures like Ubie, reveals a much more sophisticated strategy: the construction of Viking fortifications. Far from being just temporary encampments, these structures were a crucial component in defending conquered territories and consolidating power in the long term, transforming invaders into colonizers. The ability to erect robust and efficient defenses was a notable characteristic of the Vikings. When they invaded and occupied a location, they quickly transformed the area into a fortified camp or harisgere, army quartered, as described in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. These locations were chosen with great strategic acumen, often taking advantage of natural features of the terrain, such as river confluences, river loops that created easily defensible peninsulas, or marshy areas that made enemy access difficult. The construction technique was remarkably fast and efficient. The Vikings dug deep ditches and raised earth and timber walls, palisades, with astonishing speed. These fortifications were not mere barriers, but complete defensive systems, designed to protect the armada, its horses and its booty, and to serve as safe bases from which to launch further raids. Notable examples include Repton, 873-874, one of the largest and most impressive archaeological sites of a Viking settlement. Excavations have revealed a vast fortified area, including a burial mound where many Viking warriors were buried, indicating the importance of the site as a winter base and center of operations. The defenses were substantial, with large ditches and ramparts. Wareham, 876, and Fulham, 878-879. Other locations where the Vikings established fortified bases, demonstrating their ability to entrench themselves in enemy territory and withstand Anglo-Saxon sieges. At Wareham, They occupied an ancient Burr Anglo-Saxon, reinforcing their existing defenses. For the Vikings, the construction of these fortifications served multiple purposes. First, it provided security and a regrouping point after battle, allowing wounded warriors to recover and the army to resupply. Second, these bases were essential for defending the riches accumulated through plunder and Dane money. Third, and perhaps most importantly, these fortresses were the foundation for permanent settlement. Once a territory was conquered and fortified, it became a starting point for colonization, for the cultivation of the land, and for the formation of lasting settlements. Ubie, as one of the main commanders, would have played a key role in organizing and supervising these works. His pragmatic vision for establishing a Viking kingdom in England necessarily involved the ability to defend the conquered lands. These fortifications were not only monuments to Viking engineering, but visible symbols of their intention to remain, of their desire to transform England into part of their empire. They were the materialization of their goal of transforming themselves from mere raiders into lords of the land, solidifying their presence and challenging Anglo-Saxon power definitively. The year 878 was the height of crisis for Wessex, and the high point of the Viking invasion, but it also marked an unexpected setback for the great heathen army. While Alfred the Great was on the run in the Athelney marshes, a significant Viking faction, possibly led by Ubbe Ragnarsson, launched a crucial assault on southwest England. The outcome of this campaign, at the Battle of Sinwit, also known as Countisbury Hill or Cumbuch, is where Ubbe's fate becomes a mystery shrouded in historical accounts and legend. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles, the main source for this event, record that a Viking fleet of 23 ships from either Dyfed in Wales or Ireland landed at the mouth of the River Parrett in Somerset. Their aim was to increase pressure on Alfred, or perhaps to secure a new base for the Armada. They attacked the fort of Sinwit, or a hill fort, held by a Wessex nobleman named Ealdorman Otta of Devon and his thanes. The outnumbered Anglo-Saxon force was under siege, cut off from water. The Vikings, confident in their numerical superiority and the advantageous position they had taken, blocking the exit from the fortress, underestimated the determination of the Anglo-Saxon defenders. Otta and his men, in an act of desperation and courage, launched a sudden sortie before dawn. The action came as a complete shock to the Vikings, who were caught by surprise in their own camp. The ensuing battle was a massacre for the Vikings. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles report that the Anglo-Saxon victory was overwhelming. Hundreds of Vikings were killed and the victory was celebrated as a miracle. Most significant, however, was the capture of the Raven Standard, Raefan, the magical banner of the Vikings, believed to have been woven by the daughters of Ragnar Lothbrok and to possess oracular powers. Its capture was a devastating moral and spiritual blow to the Vikings. And this is where the mystery of Ubbe's death comes into play. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in some versions and later sources such as the Chronicle of Asser, explicitly state that the brother of Ivar and Halfdan was killed at Sinwit. Although Ubbe's name is not mentioned directly in all early versions of the Chronicle, the reference to brother is widely interpreted by historians as referring to Ubbe, given his prominent role in the Armada and his association with Ivar and Halfdan. The death of such a high-ranking leader and the loss of the sacred standard mark the Battle of Sinwit as one of the heaviest blows suffered by the Vikings to date. Although some Norse sagas and Irish sources place him at work in later years or elsewhere, modern historiography tends to accept that Ubbe, or at least a Viking leader of his stature, perished at Sinwit. His death would have been both a huge relief to Alfred and a major setback to Viking morale, depriving the fleet of one of its most pragmatic and experienced commanders. The mystery of his death adds a veil of drama to his legacy, making Sinwit not just a battle but the scene of a possible epic end for one of Ragnar's great sons. The figure of Ubbe Ragnarsson, like that of his brothers, transcends the dry historical record, delving deep into the realm of legend and folktale from Scandinavia, and, to a lesser extent, England. The Norse sagas, in particular, are the primary source for understanding how Ubbe was portrayed beyond his purely military role, weaving a rich tapestry of bravery, cunning, and, at times, complexity. It is important to note that these sagas, passed down orally for centuries before being written down, blend historical fact with mythical and literary elements, making Ubie a figure who inhabits both history and mythology. In the sagas, Ubie is often presented as one of Ragnar Lothbrok's most prominent and respected sons. Unlike Ivar the Boneless, whose ferocity and cunning bordered on the supernatural, or Halfdan, who focused on founding kingdoms, Ubie is often the archetypal warrior, strong, courageous, with a great sense of honor, and a pragmatic leader. He is neither the craziest nor the most ambitious, but he is consistently portrayed as a capable commander and a pillar of stability in Ragnar's family. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons, and the saga of Ragnarssona Thatr, the tale of Ragnar's sons, are the richest sources for his legendary persona. In these narratives, Ubie appears as one of the brothers who lead the great heathen army, seeking revenge for their father's death at the hands of Ella of Northumbria. His participation in the battles in England is emphasized, and he is one of the main architects of the campaign. A recurring element in the legends associated with Ubie is his connection with the Raven Banner, Riafan. Some versions of the sagas claim that this magical banner, woven by Ragnar's daughters, or by his mother Aslaug, was carried by Ubie or was in his custody. The belief was that if the raven on the banner flapped its wings on a day of battle, victory was certain. If it remained inert, defeat was imminent. The loss of the banner at Sinwit, where Ubie supposedly died, solidifies this connection and adds a tragic and mystical touch to his figure. For the defeat and death of a great Viking leader was accompanied by the loss of such a powerful talisman. Ubie is also associated with a certain prudence and stability. While Ivar is impulsive and brilliant, Ubie is the mediator, the one who holds things together. This trait makes him more human and relatable, in contrast to Ivar's almost demonic figure. His leadership is based on experience and confidence, not just terror. There is also speculation, although without solid historical evidence, that Ubie may have been one of Ragnar's first sons to seriously consider settlement and colonization, rather than just plunder. In short, legends and folktales have cemented Ubie's image as one of the great warriors and leaders of the Viking Age. He is the loyal son who avenges his father, the capable commander who forges a path of conquest, and a figure who, though often overshadowed by Ivar's eccentric brilliance, remains a key pillar in the epic narrative of Ragnar's sons. His death at Sinwit, though a mystery in detail, adds a layer of sacrifice and heroism to his legend. Among the most iconic and powerful symbols of the Vikings, the Raven Banner, known as the Rifan, from the Old Norse for raven, holds pride of place. More than a mere banner, it was an object of profound spiritual and psychological significance, imbued with a symbolic power that could inspire its bearers and terrify their enemies. For the warriors of the great heathen army, including Ubie, this banner was a link to destiny, a promise of victory or an omen of doom. The design of the Rifan was distinctive, a flying raven, often depicted in stylized form, on a white triangular or quadrangular field. Ravens were sacred animals to the Vikings, associated with Odin, the Norse god of war, wisdom, and death. Odin was often accompanied by two ravens, Hugin, thought, and Munin, memory, who flew around the world and brought him information. The raven was thus a symbol of knowledge, power, and, crucially, victory in battle. The banner was believed to have a magical aura, bringing good luck and protection to those who followed it. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles, especially those of Asser, the biographer of Alfred the Great, provide the most vivid accounts of the Rifan, albeit from the perspective of a Christian adversary. In his Life of Alfred, Asser describes the standard captured at the Battle of Sinwit, where Ubie may have died, as a fascinating object. It is said that the three sisters of Ivar and Halfdan, and Ubie, wove it. It is also said that in each battle, if they should gain victory, the raven seemed to flap its wings. If they should be defeated, it hung motionless. This description not only attributes the standard to Ragnar's sons and their sisters, perhaps Ragnar's daughters or Jarl's wives believed to possess mystical abilities, but also highlights its oracular nature. reinforcing the belief that its movement foretold the outcome of the battle. The symbolic power of the Rifan was immense. To the Vikings, it was an emblem of their pagan faith, a direct counterpoint to the Christian standards of their enemies. Its presence on the battlefield was a statement of intent. Ragnar's sons were here to conquer, and their fate was with them. The sight of the winged raven could inspire warriors to feats of bravery and strike panic into the hearts of their enemies, who saw it as a sign of the wrath of the pagan gods. The capture of the reef at Sinwit in 878 was an event of epic proportions. To the Anglo-Saxons, it was a miracle, a sign of divine intervention and the downfall of a pagan symbol. To the Vikings, the loss of the standard, coupled with the death of a prominent leader like Ubbe, if the Anglo-Saxon chronicle is correct in its interpretation, was a devastating moral blow. The loss of an object so charged with power and meaning was seen as an omen of ill fortune and a sign that the gods had abandoned their warriors. The Rifan's significance goes beyond its military representation. It encapsulates the Viking worldview, their faith in omens, their connection to the gods, and their belief in fate. While the historicity of its magical properties is debated, the banner's psychological impact on both sides of the conflict is undeniable, making it one of the most fascinating symbolic artifacts of the Viking Age. The arrival of the great heathen army in England was not only a military and political confrontation, but also a clash of deeply held beliefs: Norse paganism versus Anglo-Saxon Christianity. The question of faith in the Vikings' interaction with Christianity is a complex and fascinating aspect of their history in England, revealing nuances beyond the simplistic image of monastery raiders. While mass conversion would come later, there were instances of possible conversions, or not, among leaders and warriors driven by political expediency, marriage, or genuine conviction. Initially, the relationship was one of direct antagonism. The Vikings, as pagans, had no reverence for Christian symbols or sacred sites. Monasteries and churches, rich in treasures and without military defenses, were prime targets for plunder. The destruction of Lindisfarne and other religious centers was a testament to the lack of respect for Christian institutions. And, to the Anglo-Saxons, blasphemy. Monks were killed or enslaved, and sacred objects were looted or desecrated. However, as the Vikings began to settle and interact more deeply with the Anglo-Saxon populations, whether through trade, marriage, or rule, the dynamics of faith began to change. Conversion to Christianity, for Viking leaders, often became a strategic political tool. Accepting baptism was not only an attempt to integrate with the local Christian population, but also a way to seal peace agreements and legitimize their rule in the eyes of the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and their Christian neighbors on the continent. It was a way to be recognized as a legitimate ruler, not just an invader. The most prominent example is that of Guthrum, the Viking leader who became Alfred the Great's main adversary after the probable death of Ubie. After his defeat at the Battle of Edington in 878, Guthrum was forced to accept a peace treaty, and as part of the agreement, was baptized. Alfred was his godfather, and Guthrum was given the Christian name Ethelstan. Many of his Earl were also baptized. Although the religious sincerity of this conversion is debated, some see it as a political expediency. The fact is that it facilitated the establishment of peace and the creation of the Danelaw. Guthrum reigned over East Anglia as a Christian king, even issuing coins with Christian symbols. For figures like Ubie, there is no clear evidence of a conversion to Christianity. His association with the Raven Banner, a strong pagan symbol, and his role as one of the main leaders of the pagan invasion suggest that he remained true to his Norse beliefs. However, it is possible that he, like other leaders, had a pragmatic understanding of the faith, accepting compromises with Christians when it served the interests of the Armada. The presence of Viking burial sites in England, with mixtures of pagan and Christian symbols, or with burial rituals that combine elements of both cultures, indicates that the transition of faith was gradual and complex. Many Vikings who settled eventually converted and assimilated into Christian Anglo-Saxon culture over the generations. The question of faith, therefore, was not monolithic. It was a cultural and political battleground, where beliefs were both sources of conflict and tools of integration and legitimation. The great heathen army began their journey with revenge as their primary driver, but their goals quickly evolved into something much more ambitious and long-term: the desire for settlement. Far from being mere raiders in search of booty, many Vikings, including their leaders like Ubie, saw England not just as a battlefield, but as fertile land to cultivate and settle, building a new home and a new life. The Scandinavian lands, although rich in natural resources, were limited in arable land and subject to increasing population pressures. England, on the other hand, offered vast expanses of fertile soil, a milder climate, and an agricultural infrastructure well developed by the Anglo-Saxons. For the Norse, who were farmers at heart, these lands represented a golden opportunity to prosper. The first clear sign of this intention to settle came with the Armada's decision to winter on English soil rather than return to Scandinavia. In 865, they established themselves in East Anglia and subsequently at York, which would become Jorvik, Repton, and other locations. These were not merely military bases. They were intended to be staging posts for colonization. The construction of permanent fortifications, as seen at Repton, indicated that the Vikings were not planning a quick retreat. The split of the Great Armada in 874, with Halfdan leaving for Northumbria to settle and rule Jorvik, is a milestone in this desire for settlement. Halfdan became the Viking King of York, distributing lands to his warriors and encouraging agriculture. He transformed a conquered city into the capital of a Viking kingdom. This move set a clear precedent. Invasion was turning into colonization. Ubie, as one of the pragmatic leaders of the Armada, who remained active in subsequent campaigns in southern and eastern England, probably shared this view of settlement. Although his death at Sinwit may have prevented him from establishing a kingdom of his own, his presence in campaigns aimed at subduing and dividing lands, such as in Mercia, suggests that he saw conquest as a prelude to colonization. The idea was not just to plunder, but to possess. The most tangible result of this desire for settlement was the formation of the Danelaw. This vast region, encompassing East Anglia, parts of Mercia and Northumbria, came to be governed under the law of the Danes. Many Viking warriors, after years of fighting, retired from their raiding lives and became farmers, traders, and craftsmen. They married Anglo-Saxon women, adopted local customs, and introduced their own laws and practices. Cities such as Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, Leicester, and Stamford, the five burhs, became flourishing Viking centers, reflecting this transition to a settled society. The desire to settle was not just a strategy of conquest, but a profound shift in Viking identity in England. From itinerant warriors, they became landowners and community builders, shaping the demographic, cultural, and political landscape of England in ways that would endure for centuries. England, for many of them, ceased to be just a battlefield and became their home. Although the ultimate fate of Ubbe Ragnarsson is shrouded in some mystery, especially surrounding his alleged death at the Battle of Sinwit, his impact and legacy on future generations of Vikings in England are undeniable. As one of the leading commanders of the Great Heathen Army, and one of Ragnar Lothbrok's most prominent sons, Ubie contributed significantly to the formation of the Danelaw and the consolidation of the Norse presence on the island. His main contribution was to pave the way for permanent settlement. Ubie was not just a warrior, he was a pragmatic strategist who understood the importance of consolidating conquests. His participation in the first and most devastating campaigns, such as those in East Anglia and Northumbria, was instrumental in breaking the back of Anglo-Saxon resistance and creating the conditions for colonization. He was one of the leaders who transformed invasion into occupation and pillage into a quest for land and sovereignty. Along with Ivar and Halfdan, Ubie helped establish the Viking power base at York, Jorvik, which became the capital of the Norse kingdom of Northumbria. Although Halfdan became the first Viking king of Jorvik, Ubbe's early involvement in the conquest of the city and the subjugation of the region was crucial to the flourishing of the kingdom. The founding of Jorvik set a precedent for other Viking settlements and the eventual formation of the Danelaw. Even though he did not live to see the full materialization of the Danelaw, his vision of Viking rule in England was inherited by the generations of leaders who followed him, such as Guthrum in East Anglia. The strategy of demanding Dane money, establishing fortified bases and negotiating or imposing agreements that led to settlement, was shaped in part by Ubie's pragmatic approach. His death, if it did indeed occur at Sinwit, also had a symbolic impact. The loss of a leader of his caliber and the capture of the Raven Standard were a setback for the Armada, but did not halt the process of colonization. On the contrary, perhaps the loss of one of its most experienced leaders spurred others, such as Guthrum, to seek a more definitive agreement with Alfred, which culminated in the Treaty of Wedmore and the formalization of the Danelaw. Ubie's legacy also resides in cultural memory. In the sagas and tales, he is remembered as one of Ragnar's great sons, a courageous warrior and an influential leader. This memory, while sometimes romanticized, contributed to the rich tapestry of Viking identity in England, where descent from great leaders like Ubie conferred prestige and legitimacy. Future generations of Vikings in England, the settlers and kings of the Danelaw, inherited the territory that Ubie helped conquer, the tactics he helped refine, and the ambition to establish a prosperous society in foreign lands. Although Viking rule was eventually reabsorbed into the unified Anglo-Saxon kingdom, Ubie's legacy as one of the early architects of this vast enterprise has remained inscribed in the landscape, law, and culture of northern and eastern England. His life and actions were instrumental in shaping medieval England and Viking identity itself. The Great Heathen Armada, a force of unprecedented unity and devastation, did not remain a cohesive entity forever. After years of intense campaigning, overwhelming conquests, and considerable attrition, the Armada began to fragment, leading to the dissolution of its original unity and the divergent fortunes of its various Viking groups after the major campaigns in England. This process of division marked a transition from raiding to settlement and the formation of permanent kingdoms. The first major split in the Armada occurred in 874, after the winter at Repton. Halfdan Ragnarsson, one of Ubbe's brothers, decided to take a considerable part of the Armada to Northumbria. His intention was clear: to settle and rule the kingdom of Jorvik, York. Halfdan divided the land among his followers, who began to cultivate it, transforming themselves from warriors to settlers. This was the beginning of the Viking kingdom of Jorvik, which would become a significant power in northern England for decades. Halfdan's departure north meant that a large part of the original Armada force was disengaged from the goal of total conquest of the south. The other main faction of the Armada, led by Guthrum, and which included other Earl, possibly with continued participation by Ubie until his death in 878, concentrated their efforts on the south of England, particularly Wessex and Mercia. This group continued to pressure Alfred the Great and to establish temporary winter bases, such as at Wareham and Chippenham. Their main aim seemed to be to subdue Wessex and create a Viking domain in the southeast. After the decisive defeat at the Battle of Edington in 878, Guthrum was forced to make peace with Alfred in the Treaty of Wedmore. As part of this agreement, Guthrum and Hyserl were baptized, and he was recognized as King of East Anglia. This was a second major division of the Armada, where Guthrum's group settled permanently, abandoning campaigns of conquest to become an established power in the east. This formalized the emergence of another great Viking kingdom in England, the heartland of what would become the Danelaw. In addition to these large groups, smaller bands of Vikings, who had been part of the Great Army or who arrived later, went their own way. Some went to Ireland, where Ivar the Boneless had already established a significant presence in Dublin. Others dispersed across the continent, seeking their fortunes in Friesland, France, or elsewhere in Europe. The dissolution of the Great Army did not mean the end of the Viking presence in England, but rather a change in its nature. From a unified invasion army, it evolved into a series of semi-independent kingdoms and settlements, each with its own leaders and goals. This fragmentation, while dispelling the threat of a single overwhelming Viking army, resulted in the creation of enduring Viking domains that would shape England's identity for centuries. The warriors who had arrived under a single banner were now settlers, traders, and rulers, redefining the island's Viking Age legacy. As the Great Heathen Army advanced on England, its composition and objectives were fluid. influenced by the ambitions of its leaders and the opportunities that arose. Although much of the focus has been on the campaigns in England, there is some evidence and speculation that Ubbe Ragnarsson may have participated in or led an expedition eastwards, in a search for new lands that would have taken him as far as Frisia or beyond. This perspective expands our understanding of the scope and motivations of Viking leaders. The historical sources for Ubbe's activities outside England are less detailed and more subject to interpretation. However, the year 875 is crucial. After the division of the Great Army at Repton, with Halfdan going north and Guthrum and other leaders remaining in the south, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions that a part of the Great Army moved to Cambridge. However, some interpretations of texts and sagas suggest that Ubbe may have withdrawn from part of the main campaign in England for a period, seeking other opportunities. Friesland, located on the North Sea coast, modern-day Netherlands and Germany, was a region of great interest to the Vikings. It was an area rich in trade, with access to important river and coastal routes to the European mainland. Many Vikings, including the Danes, had already established a presence there, whether through raids, tribute agreements, or settlements. Indeed, Godfred, a contemporary Viking king, was given Friesland as Afifov the Carolingian emperor. The idea of Ubbe leading an expedition into Frisia or adjacent regions is plausible. He was a pragmatic leader, always looking for opportunities for his people and to consolidate Viking power. If England was becoming a saturated battleground, or if additional resources were needed, a foray into a rich, less defended region on the continent would make strategic sense. Such expeditions could have a variety of objectives: plunder and resupply, obtain wealth and supplies for ongoing campaigns in England, establishment of new bases, create support points for future operations on the mainland or as safe havens, commercial expansion, control trade routes and profitable markets, opening new fronts, diversifying targets and pressure on Christian kingdoms. Although there is no undisputed archaeological or textual evidence that places Ubbe specifically in Frisia, the movement of Viking fleets into this region was common. The mention of his presence in later campaigns in Wessex, culminating in his probable death at Sinwit in 878, suggests that if there was such an expedition, it was temporary, and he returned to England. This quest for new lands is not limited to a single leader or location. Reflects the expansive mindset of the Vikings, who saw the world as a vast field of opportunity. For Ubbe, even if his involvement is more speculative, the possibility of exploring Eastern Europe or other coastal regions before returning to the main setting of England adds a layer of complexity to his biography, showing him as a leader with a broad vision of dominion and exploration, not confined to the British Isles. After years of tenacious resistance, humiliating escapes, and the payment of Dane money, Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, finally came to an unshakable conclusion. Peace with the Vikings was an illusion. His word could not be trusted, and the only way to save the Kingdom of Wessex, and perhaps Anglo-Saxon England itself, was through a final, decisive confrontation that would drive out the invaders once and for all. This realization led Alfred to relentless pressure on the Vikings, culminating in one of the most important turning points of the Viking Age in England. The turning point was the winter of 877-878. The Great Armada, led by Guthrum and including prominent Earl, launched a surprise attack on Chippenham, a royal residence of Alfred, during Christmas. The blow was so devastating that Alfred was forced to flee to the Athelney marshes in Somerset, reduced to a guerrilla figure. Anglo-Saxon England was on the brink of collapse. However, rather than give up, Alfred used this period of adversity to reorganize his forces. Hiding in Athelney, he built a makeshift fortress and, crucially, began to raise a new army. His escape and subsequent re-emergence became the basis for legends, such as that of the burnt cake, which humanized the king and inspire his people. Alfred's relentless pressure began to manifest itself in his military reform. He had learned from Viking tactics. Alfred improved the system off-hired militia, creating a more organized and available force. Most importantly, he began building a network of burhs, defensive fortifications, which were fortified towns strategically positioned to defend the kingdom and act as bases of resistance against future invasions. These fortresses would be vital to the protection of Wessex. In May 878, Alfred, emerging from his hiding place, summoned his firemen. The reunion in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles is described with emotion, with warriors eager to fight alongside their king. The final confrontation took place at the Battle of Edington, Ethandun. Alfred's army, although smaller than the Viking armada, was determined and disciplined. The battle was a brutal clash of shield walls, a fight for survival. The Anglo-Saxon victory at Edington was overwhelming. The chronicles record a relentless pursuit of the Vikings to their stronghold at Chippenham, where they were besieged. The siege lasted 14 days, and the Vikings, starving and demoralized, were forced to surrender. The result of the final confrontation was not annihilation, but a strategic submission. Guthrum, the Viking leader, and 29 of his earl were baptized in Alfred's presence, with the king himself serving as Guthrum's godfather. The Treaty of Wedmore was then signed, establishing a border between Alfred's kingdom and Viking territory, the future Danelaw. The victory at Edington and the Treaty of Wedmore were the culmination of Alfred's pressure. He not only drove the main Viking force from his kingdom, but also secured relative peace and the conversion of their leaders, legitimizing the Viking settlement in Anglo-Saxon terms. This victory not only saved Wessex, but laid the foundations for the unification of England under an Anglo-Saxon crown, a direct legacy of Alfred's unrelenting pressure to expel and ultimately control the Viking threat. The figure of Ubbe Ragnarsson is predominantly associated with the Viking campaigns in England, but his origins and status as one of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok imply considerable influence in his native Denmark. Although the Anglo-Saxon chronicles and sagas focus on his actions abroad, it is plausible to infer that Ubie enjoyed a high status among Danish nobles and warriors, even when he was away from home. First, the mere fact of being a son of Ragnar Lothbrok gave Ubie immense prestige. Ragnar, whether a historical figure or a legend, was a renowned king and leader, and his sons were considered to be of royal lineage, or at the very least of high nobility. This gave them a natural authority and the right to raise armies and lead great expeditions. Ubie's participation in the Great Heathen Armada, one of the largest armies ever assembled in Scandinavia, attests to his power of mobilization and his recognition as a competent leader. Even though they were in England, Ubie and his brothers maintained connections with Denmark. The Great Armada was composed of warriors from various Scandinavian regions, but the Danes formed a substantial part. The resources obtained through plunder and Dane money in England, although used to finance campaigns, could also have been sent back to Denmark, increasing the wealth and power of their respective clans and, consequently, the status of the leaders. Ubie's leadership was crucial to maintaining the cohesion of the navy in its early years. His ability to mediate between the different the diverse factions that made up the army, was a vital skill, one that would have been highly valued both on the battlefield and in his homeland. This kind of pragmatic and unifying leadership would have been a factor in maintaining the loyalty of his followers, many of whom would have been Danes. Furthermore, if Ubie did indeed survive some of the early campaigns and return to Denmark, a theory that is less historically accepted, but is present in some sagas, his status would only have been enhanced by the treasures and war experience he would have brought with him. He would have been a conquering hero, a veteran of campaigns that shook entire kingdoms. Even without a definitive return to Denmark, the impact of their conquests in England resonated back home. The colonization of the Danelaw, the creation of Viking kingdoms on English soil, and the wealth that flowed into Scandinavia from these newly conquered lands all enhanced the prestige of Ragnar's sons. Ubbe, as one of the architects of this enterprise, would be remembered and respected for his role in shaping the Viking Age. Ubie's influence in Denmark was not necessarily through direct reign, but rather through his lineage, his reputation as an effective warrior and leader, and his contribution to the expansion of Danish power abroad. He was part of a warrior elite who saw the world as an open field for conquest and settlement, and his position as the son of Ragnar Lothbrok gave him an honored place among the greats of his time. The image of the Vikings is often simplified to one of brutal warriors, relentless raiders. However, for leaders like Ubbe Ragnarsson, this one-dimensional view fails to capture the complexity of their personalities and the multiple roles they played. Exploring alternative views of Ubie, beyond the ruthless conqueror, allows us to glimpse the human side of the warrior, revealing nuances of pragmatism, strategy, leadership, and perhaps even dilemmas. Ubie, in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles and sagas, is portrayed primarily in his military and leadership role in the great heathen army. However, his constant presence in negotiations and his apparent preference for compromise and settlement, in contrast to Ivar's ferocity, suggest a more calculating and adaptable mind. He was not blind to the need for diplomacy and for consolidating gains through non-violent means, such as demanding Dane money or the formation of alliances, even if temporary and of convenience. This ability to see beyond the immediate battle is a trait of a leader with a long-term vision, who sought to build, not just destroy. His ability to hold together the Great Armada, a vast army made up of different warlords with their own ambitions, demonstrates a remarkable capacity for mediation and management. Ubbe could not have done this through brute force alone. He would have needed charisma, persuasion, and a deep understanding of his men's motivations. He was in many ways the diplomat among his brothers, a liaison between the various factions that made up the Viking force. The life of a Viking leader, however brutal, was also permeated by responsibilities to his men. He was their provider, their protector. In a winter camp such as Repton, Ubbe would be responsible for logistics, troop morale, and the resolution of internal disputes. These tasks required not only authority, but also an understanding of the human needs of his followers, a sense of justice within his own code of conduct, and ultimately, care. The sagas, while glorifying, sometimes hint at the complexity of family relationships. Ragnar's revenge, for example, was not simply an act of war, but a deep emotional commitment to his father. Ubbe, as one of the eldest sons, probably carried a sense of responsibility for his family's honor and his father's legacy. This could imply an emotional and moral burden that went beyond mere conquest. While we have no record of his innermost thoughts or moments of weakness, imagining Ubbe as a complex human being, with his own worries, fears, and ambitions, is crucial to a fuller understanding of the Viking Age. He was not just a war machine. He was a man who navigated a brutal world with intelligence, pragmatism, and a leadership that, while ruthless to his enemies, was vital to his own men. This more nuanced view allows us to appreciate the depth of the story, recognizing that even the conquerors were, at their core, multifaceted human beings. The narrative of Ubbe's campaigns and the great heathen armada in England is not based solely on chronicles and sagas, but is solidly reinforced by a wealth of archaeological remains. These tangible discoveries are crucial as they confirm the Viking presence and impact on the island, providing material evidence that fills in the gaps in the written record and brings history to life. Archaeology has been instrumental in validating and expanding our understanding of the Viking Age. One of the most significant archaeological sites is at Repton in Derbyshire, where the Great Armada spent the winter of 873–874. Extensive excavations have revealed Viking fortifications, huge moats and earthen walls that surrounded the ancient Anglo-Saxon monastery. Most notably, a large burial mound containing the remains of at least 264 individuals has been discovered. Although the remains are not exclusively Viking, most show evidence of battle trauma, and carbon-14 dates point to the period when the Armada was present. One skeleton in particular, of a tall, robust man with signs of battle wounds, is believed by many to be that of a Viking leader, possibly Halfdan, one of Ubbe's brothers, or another Arlof note. The presence of a mass grave and fortifications confirm the chronicle description of a large Viking winter camp. Jorvik is another archaeological treasure trove. Excavations at Coppergate and other sites have revealed extensive Viking settlements, with evidence of houses, workshops, trade, and burial sites. Thousands of artifacts have been found, including jewelry, tools, weapons, coins, and shipwrecks. The richness and diversity of these finds demonstrate that Jorvik was not just a military base, but a vibrant urban center under Norse rule, a testament to the settlement and colonization that Ubbe and his brothers sought. The archaeological evidence shows a fusion of cultures, with Anglo-Saxon and Norse objects found side by side. Other findings include Viking warrior graves scattered throughout England, containing weapons, jewelry, and other funerary goods that corroborate the presence of Norse warriors and their rituals. Coins. The minting of coins bearing the names of Viking kings such as Guthrum, who was baptized as Ethelstan, and the discovery of large silver hoards, buried, such as the Queerdale treasure, are evidence of the vast economic system and wealth accumulated by the Vikings through Thedain money and trade. Place names. The persistence of place names of Norse origin, such as those ending in by, Thorpe, Toft, in regions of the Danelaw, is linguistic evidence of lasting Viking settlement and influence. Weapons and equipment. Discoveries of swords, axes, helmets, and shields at various battle and settlement sites confirm the warfare tactics and weaponry used by the Vikings. These archaeological remains are more than mere objects. They are time capsules that connect us directly to the past. They confirm the scale of the invasion, the nature of the camps, the intensity of the battles, and the depth of Viking settlement. For Ubie's story, even if no artifacts can be directly attributed to him, the massive presence of Viking evidence in the east and north of England validates the setting and impact of the campaigns he led, giving a solid material basis to historical narratives. In an army like the Great Heathen Army, made up of thousands of warriors from different clans and backgrounds, the strength of a leader was the glue that held it together. Ubbe Ragnarsson, as one of the chief commanders, demonstrated a remarkable ability to maintain the loyalty of his warriors, a quality essential to the success of such a grand and prolonged undertaking. Far from being simply a question of power, this loyalty was forged by a combination of factors: prestige, success in battle, pragmatism, and perhaps a sense of justice. First, his lineage as the son of Ragnar Lothbrok already gave him considerable prestige. Ragnar was a legendary figure, and his sons inherited some of his aura of invincibility and daring. To be led by a son of Ragnar conferred honor and a sense of purpose, especially in a campaign to avenge one's father. However, bloodline alone was not enough to retain the loyalty of Viking warriors, who were notoriously independent and greedy for glory and plunder. Ubbe's ability to succeed in battle and secure riches was crucial. Victories in East Anglia and Northumbria, and the subsequent acquisition of Dane money, showed their warriors that following Ubie was worth it. Leaders who failed to deliver victories and spoils quickly lost support. Ubie, on the other hand, was a leader who delivered results. Beyond plunder, Ubie seemed to have a pragmatism that set him apart. While Ivar was the ruthless, tactical genius, Ubie was the long-term strategist, the negotiator. His participation in the peace negotiations and Thedain money was not seen as weakness, but as a clever way to accumulate resources without unnecessary losses. Ubie's ability to move between warfare and diplomacy, and to see settlement as an ultimate goal, may have appealed to many warriors who sought not only glory, but land to live and farm. The discipline and organization that Ubie imposed on his part of the armada would also have been important factors. In such a large army, chaos could easily ensue. Ubie's leadership, which manifested itself in the construction of winter fortifications and logistical management, ensured that the warriors were well fed, housed, and prepared for the next phase of the campaign. A leader who cares for his men and ensures their survival and well-being is a respected leader. Although we do not have direct speeches by Ubie that demonstrate his oratorical power, his constant presence and role in multiple campaigns attest to his ability to lead by example. He was on the battlefield, in negotiations, and at crucial decisions. This closeness to his men and his active participation in events shaped their loyalty. Even though the armada split, the faction that Ubie led remained a powerful and cohesive force until his supposed death at Sinwit, which is a testament to his ability to inspire and maintain the loyalty of his warriors. Ubie's strength as a leader was critical to the persistence and success of the Great Armada in England. The story of Ubbe Ragnarsson is a complex interweaving of historical facts, Anglo-Saxon chronicles, Norse sagas, and, more recently, interpretations in popular culture. As one of the prominent sons of Ragnar Lothbrok and a key leader of the Great Heathen Army, The legacy of his name has endured, shaping the way he is remembered in history and popular culture, though he is often overshadowed by figures such as Ivar the Boneless or Alfred the Great. In recorded history, Anglo-Saxon chronicles mention him as one of the brothers who led the devastating invasion of England in the 9th century. He is associated with the conquest of East Anglia and Northumbria, the securing of Dane money, and the continued pressure on Wessex. His alleged death at Sinwit in 878, where the Raven Standard was captured, is a significant milestone in his historical biography. Here he is remembered as one of the architects of the Viking presence in much of England, a military leader and pragmatic negotiator who contributed directly to the formation of the Danelaw. In the Norse sagas, Ubbe's figure is more legendary. He is consistently portrayed as a courageous warrior and one of the main leaders of the revenge for his father, Ragnar. Although less dramatic than Ivar, who is almost a mythological character in his cruelty and cunning, Ubbe is the more sensible brother, the reliable strategist. His connection to the Raven Banner, Riafan, is emphasized, and he is seen as a pillar of strength among Ragnar's sons. His death in battle, albeit in varying detail, solidifies his image as a hero who fought bravely for his family's honor. These sagas, passed down orally and later written down, ensured that his name was immortalized in the pantheon of great Vikings. In modern popular culture, Ubbe has gained new life, particularly through television series, films, and video games. His most prominent portrayal is in the series Vikings, where he is portrayed as a central and complex character. In this series, Ubbe is often the most sympathetic and diplomatic of Ragnar's sons, seeking settlement and peace, and even showing a more open-mindedness towards Christianity. He is portrayed as a formidable warrior, but also as a leader with a strong sense of morality and justice, someone who cares about his people and building a lasting legacy. This portrayal, although fictionalized, has helped solidify Ubbe's image for a new generation, often attributing to him more noble and heroic characteristics than those strictly contained in the historical sources. The legacy of his name, then, is multifaceted. In history, he is one of the great conquerors of the Viking Age. In the sagas, he is a tragic and loyal hero. In popular culture, he is a character who resonates with modern ideals of leadership and purpose. Regardless of the source, Ubbe Ragnarsson is remembered as a pivotal figure in the transformation of Anglo-Saxon England and the rise of Viking power, a name that echoes through the centuries as a symbol of strength, strategy, and the relentless pursuit of a new world. The culmination of the campaigns of the Great Heathen Armada and the lasting legacy of the conquests, led by Ubbe and his brothers, materialized in the formation of the Danelaw, from the Old English Dana law, meaning law of the Danes. More than a mere area of occupation, the Danelaw was a vast territory under Danish law, a direct and profound result of the Viking conquests that shaped the political and economic future of England in irrevocable ways. The formation of the Danelaw was not a single event, but a gradual process. It began with the initial conquests of Ubbe and Ivar in East Anglia and Northumbria, where Jorvik, became the capital of a Viking kingdom. The subsequent division of the Great Armada, with Halfdan settling in the north and Guthrum, after his defeat at Edington and the Treaty of Wedmore with Alfred the Great, settling in East Anglia, solidified the foundations for these dominions. Mercia, in turn, was also divided and partly colonized by the Vikings. The Danelaw covered a vast area from north of the Thames to the River Tees, including East Anglia, Essex, and parts of Mercia and Northumbria. These lands were not only occupied militarily, but also colonized. Many Viking warriors, after years of fighting, were granted land and became farmers. They married Anglo-Saxon women, established families and built communities, gradually merging with the local population, although maintaining their own laws and customs. The political impact of the Danelaw was immense. It created an England divided in two: the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, unified under Alfred and his successors, and the vast area under Viking control. This division would persist for almost a century, with constant conflict and negotiation. The existence of the Danelaw forced the kings of Wessex to become more militarily strong and strategically unified, paving the way for the eventual unification of all England under a single Anglo-Saxon crown, but only after centuries of struggle and assimilation. Economically, the Danelaw was a vibrant center of trade. Viking-controlled towns such as Jorvik, York, Lincoln, Nottingham, Stamford, Derby, and Leicester, the Five Burgs, flourished as important trading posts, connecting England to Scandinavian and Baltic trade networks. New trade routes were opened, and Viking coinage stimulated the economy. The introduction of Norse farming practices and navigational techniques also contributed to the region's prosperity. Culturally, the Danelaw resulted in a rich fusion of cultures. Although Old English remained the main language, Old Norse left its mark on vocabulary, grammar, and place names. Danish laws, focused on principles of justice and property, influenced the English legal system. Art, beliefs, and customs also blended, creating a hybrid identity that is still visible in archaeological and linguistic remains. The dawn of the Danelaw was therefore the culmination of the Vikings' journey of conquest. It was the direct result of the brutal campaigns and pragmatic strategies of leaders such as Ubbe Ragnarsson. It marked the end of the age of raiding and the beginning of an era of settlement, colonization, and the often tense coexistence between Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, shaping the political, economic, and cultural landscape of England in lasting ways. England would never be the same after the Danelaw.